Now I'd like to introduce our host, Jason Maganoy, Head of Business Development at St. Joseph Media. Take it away, Jason.
Thank you so much, Chantel, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm really excited to have Rodney Diverlus here with us today. Rodney is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Toronto. He curates large-scale public installations that blur the lines of protest and performance, and has recently published his first publication, Until We Are Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matter in Canada. His art practice straddles the realms of theater, dance, and Afro-diasporic modalities, and has created interpreted works with and for Canada's leading artistic institutions, including the Stratford Festival, Canadian Opera Company, Art Gallery of Ontario, and Dance Makers. How are you, Rodney? How have you been holding up during this really incredible and difficult time?
Hi, Jason. Thank you for asking. It's a sort of, it's a mixed emotions. I'm sort of holding two truths right now. It's an electrifying moment to be community building and to be engaged in community. I feel awakened and sort of revived, but at the same time, it's exhausting as well. It's constant. I'd rather have a conversation with you about something else. It's pretty exhausting talking about my family, my friends, communities' lives constantly. And so I'm sort of just holding both of those truths, but I'm okay. Thank you for asking.
Tell us about your journey into, you're an artist, which is incredible. And tell us about your journey into activism. How did Black Lives Matter Toronto start?
Yeah, I mean, for myself, I sort of stumbled into activism out of the necessity and out of survival. So I'm not a career activist. And such, I sort of see my role as a community builder. And even while engaging in tactics that might seem divisive or disruptive. So personally, I was born in Haiti, country where civic engagement is sort of embedded in our DNA. I was raised in the United States, which sort of opened my eyes to the vast possibilities, really, of racial, economic, and social inequities. And then moved here to Canada, where culturally we revel in the statement, it's not that bad here. So as such, being from these three different countries sort of have infused my journey into activism. And specifically, Black Lives Matter Toronto began in November 2014. There was a worldwide call. At the time, there was an uprising happening in Ferguson, Missouri over the death of Mike Brown at the hands of a police officer. There was a worldwide call for solidarity actions. And there was a group of us in Toronto who were at the Black Coalition for AIDS Prevention offices one night. And we were sort of frustrated that the conversation, while we were talking about the death that happened in the US, there was another gentleman at the Peel region, Jermaine Carby, who also died at the hand of police. And there was no media coverage, no conversation about it. So that night we made a decision to bring people together the next day to sort of commemorate Jermaine Carby's life and create a conversation about his case and his situation, which saw thousands of people literally the next day take the streets. And since then, BLMTO has sort of grown into an organization that's really international in scope and in focus.
It's amazing. Right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And then on top of that, there's another pandemic. Yeah. Do we have the energy for all of this? I mean, I already see on social media that people are talking or preparing for when things start to slow down. Like maybe we're not going to be hitting the streets as much. The NBA is going to be restarting. We're going to have a lot of distractions in the summer. So how do we keep momentum? What are the small wins that we need to keep us going for those larger victories?
Yeah, I mean, that question is, that's a PhD thesis right there, right? I think that particularly for Black communities, we're experiencing not just a pandemic on top of a pandemic, like we're experiencing a crisis within a crisis within a crisis within a crisis. And that most of these crises already were in existence before the pandemic. The pandemic sort of just puts them, highlights them. Specifically, the economic system and the labor market, there had been studies that talked about the racialization of the labor market. 1 in 5 Canadian jobs being precarious, and many of those being occupied by racialized and vulnerable communities. We had already been talking about policing in the criminal justice system. We had already been talking about health disparities and the many ways that Black, Indigenous, poor, and other communities are disproportionately impacted by negative health outcomes. All of those were before the pandemic. And as such, with the pandemic hitting, it really sort of puts everything at the forefront, and all of these sort of crises or exacerbated by this moment. And so, I mean, do we have the energy to continue this work? We kind of have to, because if these crises were already crises before the pandemic has sort of exacerbated these issues, and they're only going to get worse if we don't intervene as a society. So to me, I'm really interested in seeing what are the wins that communities are able to get. What are the sort of new legislation, new systems, new protocols that we're able to get. But I also, as somebody who's been talking about Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter since 2014, the narrative and the cultural shift is also a victory. In 2014, it was really a fringe group of outsiders, more like that were calling for Black Lives Matter. We were seen as radical. We were seen as disruptive and destructive. And as such, the change that's happened in the 60 years for it to now become a term that's from Yukon to Brazil, to Stratford, to China, to Australia, it's sort of normalized in a way. I think that narrative shift is also a victory. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what activists on the ground in different jurisdictions are able to win. What are the sort of really deep changes that are able to be done on their police departments, in their city councils, and their legislatures. And without those victories, I will come back to you having the same conversation 5 years from now, in another 5 years, as my ancestors have been, as my parents and my grandparents and my ancestors have been having this conversation for decades and centuries before me.
And I think you nailed it. That's what I've been so inspired by, just seeing all of the actions around the world, which has been like, I've never seen anything like that. And that actually is a really good segue into my next question, which is, and I've been reading about how to be a better ally. But what almost always ends up happening is people just fall into like a lot of performing of allyship. So they do something, they get called out, they try again. Nope, that's wrong too. But can't it be imperfect if the ultimate goal for everyone is the same?
It will never be perfect. Like, it will just there is no sort of, these systems that we are talking about are things that you and I did not create, but we sort of just inherited. These are realities that we have inherited in a way. And so communities, like when you're an ally to a community, the community is not homogeneous. The community, it's not everybody in the Black community believes in the same way forward. Not everybody in the queer community believes in the same way forward. So as such, if you're wanting to be an ally to the community, it's holding that complexity, and that this particular group of folks might be pushing for this way forward, but this group of folks with the same identity are also pushing this way forward. It's complicated. But these systems are complicated. Oppression is complicated. The differences that the economic, political, racial lines that separate myself, you, the folks watching this conversation are complicated. And so I think that rather than avoiding getting in the mess, I actually encourage people to dive face first in the mess. And diving face first in it is because if you are a community if you're a marginalized community, you don't have an option. If you're a Black community, if you're a Black family, if you're a Black father and a Black mother, you have no option but to talk to your child about the police. There is no option. So for those of us who are in positions of privilege, it is. I have no choice but to be talking about the need to support Black trans women, because Black trans women have to talk about their lives every day. And as such, if I want to be an ally to that community, I actually have to actively be ready to be uncomfortable, be ready to be called out, be ready to be told that, no, actually, we need you to do it this way. That's part of the work. It's a sort of lifelong commitment. Otherwise, it's just performing. And as a performer myself, I can tell you that when the performance ends, it ends and real life continues. So if people are committed to doing this as a sort of real life practice, you sort of have to really examine everything that's led you up to here. Because everything that's led us up to here has, for lack of better words, led us up to here.
Yeah, and that idea of work. I mean, that's the thing that I've been discovering as I've been doing more reading. It's like this idea of whenever you feel like there's racial progress, you start realizing that racism is actually super sophisticated. So
Absolutely.
you actually have to do a ton of work to combat something that's that complex, like you said,
Oh,
complicated. It's like,
Jason, you've hit the nail on the road. Like it actually, racism has been dissected by academics, by community members for decades. Like there are, I have personally read hundreds of books on race, anti-racist theories, on racism frameworks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as such, and that's from also having lived experience from somebody who's experienced anti-Black racism. So I would consider myself having a level of expertise on the issue, both from the personal, but also from the academic and reading it. So that's, and that I still have a long way to go. So I think that if folks here have read a book, I mean, I hate to say it, but the work is so much beyond that, and that we have to be ready to meet the conversation where it's at. What I mean by that is last week I did a slew of interviews on defining systemic racism. And the interviews were really based on this sort of premise that we don't have the language to talk about systemic racism in Canada. And to be honest with you, I was really frustrated doing that interview because it's to pretend like we have to start back from scratch when there's been decades of research, when there's been decades of debates, when there's been decades of term defining, of community engagement. All of those have been defined. And when we constantly go back to the start, when we constantly act like we're new, what we're doing is we're actually hampering the work from evolving forward. So it does mean, unfortunately, if you are new to talking about racial justice work, which is, we all are new to something, right? Like it's only myself, I'm really trying to think about my own self. I'm trying to think about disability justice in my own work. So I'm new to that work. It's incumbent on me then to catch up, to read, to make sure that when there are events that are talking about that issue, that I'm there, to read newspapers, to read books, to sort of catch up so I can meet people in the debate in 2020 rather than spewing terms from 1980. It's sort of there is no other option in a way. And it's incumbent on us as allies to sort of do that work. The more that we educate ourselves, the more that we take in and ingest what people have been saying, the more that we actually listen, right? Some of these things, like I've said, we've been saying, Black communities have been talking about police violence way before my generation, way before my parents, way before my grandparents. Like, have been consistently talking about the same topic. So the more that we actually stop and listen to actually hear what is at the core of people's concerns, the more that we're more than equipped to support people when they need us to take action as allies.
and that actually moves into the next question, which is, James Baldwin, he's going viral again, and I love him, and he had this incredible line, like, how much time do you want me to give for your progress? So obviously it seems like there's an urgency to make change right now. And then there's Barack Obama, who talks about incremental change, building your community, gaining power, and knowing that history will ultimately move in our direction. So I think there's the urgent change, there's a call for urgent change, and then there's a long game. So how do you play both hands effectively right now? And how do you ensure that the change that is created is long lasting?
Yeah, I think I'm a strategist. That's at the core of the work that I do. And I think that if I were to advise someone right now pushing for societal change, strategically, you want to do both. For me, both have to be held and balanced at the same time, because there is a sense of urgency for a lot of communities, right? If you are the family of Regis Korchinski Paquette, whose daughter just died last month, if you're the family of Ahmaud Arbery, if you're the family of George Floyd, if you're the family of Chantel Moore, these Black and Indigenous lives that have been lost, if you're their families or their community members, there is urgency, right? People are dying. But at the same time, we also know that it is it's simple to think that by just adopting a legislation right now, the issue will be gone. And for many of us, we're sort of driven by this instant satisfaction of like, I want to see this issue turned into law, and then that's it, it's done. But that the reality is that it does take time to develop alternatives to these systems that have existed for centuries. And so what I think that Barack Obama has missed in his statement is that there actually has been a lot of incremental change from time, and that people have been trying to build communities and have been trying to gain power. It's that the changes that we're seeing are not enough for the rate of how much these issues are exacerbated. So we have been educating, we have been mobilizing, we have been speaking to media, we've been going back to our communities. Myself, as one individual lone Black person, has done a lot of that for most of my adult life. And so at some point, I would like to go and sit sipping Mai Tai somewhere chilling and not have to talk about the need to defend my life. At some point, I would like to do that. And so for me, I have a sense of urgency in wanting to see some of these changes done. But it's both of these things have to be held. I also think that, if we look at if we're pushing for quick, urgent change without doing the sort of groundwork of building communities, of changing culture, changing mindsets, changing the narrative, as we've talked about earlier, it's easy for legislative change and policy changes to be reversed. We've seen this in Ontario, right? 2014 and 2017, there was a lot of Black activism happening when BLMTO first started. And what that resulted in is a number of changes, both provincially and in the city, across the country as well. We saw police oversight finally be taken up provincially and legislation be passed. Anti-Black racism unit was created in the city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we saw was with one election, most of these changes were able to be reversed. And as such, as community, we see that. We sort of see through the thin veil of progress, when in my short adult life, I've seen progress come and go within an election like that. And as such, what we're pushing for is more sustainable, more long-term sustainable, real change that impacts us all. And that can only be done if we're all in the sort of mix. If we're all of us, not just Black and Indigenous communities, are coming up with solutions, if all of us together are making commitments to some of these solutions.
And that's so interesting about just, that work that has to happen. It's like roots. You have to build. It's a very difficult process to build something. But then I find that a lot of the times we get stuck in the mud. Like we get stuck in the mud when it comes to semantics. For example, the word defund. So when we say defund, it means defund. It means defund. But then everything you see on social right now is like we walk it back. It actually means. So do we do that because we know that there might be a limit to what change society can stomach at one time?
Yeah. And
are we trapping ourselves because we're so worried about a backlash that we always we take a word and we just kind of weaken the word over the course of a period of time?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, you hit that nail right on the head. It's sort of it frustrates me when we get stuck in semantics. I'm just come on, y'all. Come on, let's go, right? However you want to title it, blue elephant. What is it? Ultimately, a title doesn't mean anything. Is what is actually what is the substance out of it? What does it accomplish, or what do we hope it accomplished? Because we also know that even if we hope that legislation accomplished something, when after 3-4 years of it working, it might not work, and we might have to go back to the drawing table. So to me, I feel like semantics are often a distraction tool, and that I've seen that used many times, specifically around Black activism, right? If we look back 6 years ago, when Black Lives Matter came, right away, there was a semantic around, well, how are you just saying Black Lives Matter? Aren't all lives matter? Okay, well then, and months later, blue lives matter, as if blue lives are real human beings. So we were stuck in the semantics of 3 words when Black activists were not saying that none of us were saying not all lives matter. We're talking about Black lives in that context. And so it was sort of really distracting, to be honest with you, to spend so much energy just stuck on the semantics without actually talking about the core issue. So I think that for me, when you think about the term defunding, that it will look different across every jurisdiction. And that part of the reason that it's so complex right now is because, a slogan, defunding, looks really good on a social media graphic or on a website, defundthepolice.org. But what that actual slogan is attempting to talk about is actually a whole slew of things. It's, for some people, they want to talk about racial profiling. For some people, they want to talk about how much money is put towards policing. For some people, they want to talk about alternatives to policing. All of those things are all under this sort of broader defund umbrella, but ultimately none of that matters until we see the legislation or the policy. You can call a defund police motion that has nothing to do with defunding the police. The title of it doesn't really, to me, it's insignificant, but what's significant is what do we actually get out of it and what we're hoping to push for. So for me personally, when I think about defunding, and in our work at the LMTO, we think it's more complex than just defunding the police. So to me, defunding is simple. It literally means defunding. Taking funds away, not funding at the level, right? But that is one aspect. The money bit is one aspect. I also think it's important to have a conversation about demilitarizing our police, talking about how routine policing is now way more militarized, that there's SWAT teams that are being called for routine policing, that when things in our cities like the G20 happens, we spend $1 billion in security apparatus that stay in our cities, and that our city police departments are using military-grade weapons against their own domestic residents and citizens. When we talk about defunding the police as well, I want to talk about decriminalizing, because we know that routine policing is oftentimes meant to routine poverty. We spend so much money on police to go under the gardener to remove tent cities, way more than we do to build affordable housing for those same people. So for me, there's a lot of things that we consider crimes in this country that actually, to me, are not, that actually warrant a collective conversation about how do we actually decriminalize some of the things that put people behind bars? How do we actually see drug addiction as mental health and health related rather than a criminal issue? To me, defunding also means democratizing. If the police's role is meant to be providing safety, there is no sort of, for me as a public, all of us are paying our tax base to the police department. And we know that the police department doesn't provide safety for all of us. So I actually want to democratize the conversation on safety. What is actually needed for Rexdale versus Rosedale? What is actually needed for Scarborough versus Forest Hill? How do we actually democratize safety? How do we actually give the tools for communities to define in their own ways? How do they provide their own safety? What is the best way for their communities to remain safe? And then ultimately, the last conversation around defunding is a conversation on dismantling, because ultimately we know that the policing system is actually working precisely how it's meant to. And as such, we can talk about incremental changes that need to happen as that. But there's some jurisdictions like Minneapolis, like LA, who are having real conversations about what does it create alternative? What is an alternative safety system? What is an alternative safety service for our communities? And for me, that conversation is so long because we know that not everybody is anti-cop police. There's a lot of folks who feel really safe by the police. But by not opening that conversation up about the possibilities, we're limiting ourselves and our imaginations to thinking about safety in a more broad way. So all of that is just my perspective on defund. If you ask somebody else, there's a whole other slew of things that folks want to get in sort of under this slogan. So this sort of slogan, sort of similarly to Black Lives Matter, is a broad umbrella term for a whole variety of things that will look different across jurisdictions, across different countries, because criminalization and policing looks different across every jurisdiction in every country.
I think that you nailed that, this idea of imagination. I mean, even the word, like the term public safety, I think that people should use their imagination. There are lots of ways that we can explore public safety in a community. And I think one of the things about defunding the police that has become so interesting is that people are obsessed with it. Like now it's a thing. So if you were to go, okay, look, defunding the police is a central issue. We're recognizing the inherent harms of policing itself. We understand that crime is criminalizing poverty, which is insane. Yeah. And as a result, there's all these protests happening in Toronto. Some friends on city council who we really love, like Kristen Wong-Tang, come back and they say 10% cut. And then Black Lives Matter Toronto comes out with a 50% budget cut for the police. So say it happens. Say you nail that and we get that 50% cut. What do you want to invest that 50% in instead?
Ooh, there are so many alternatives to policing. So like as I've alluded to earlier, that what we consider as policing, if we actually look at what the police does, most people think it's, we watch cops and we watch these movies and we think, all of it is just to stop all these bad guys and they're just running in, slamming and saving us all. But most of the time, actually, routine policing has actually turned into traffic services, mental health services, bylaw enforcement, parking, construction supervision, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, I'd want to see a part of the defunding is not just for austerity. It's not just to cut and to save budgets. It's actually to take that money and to reallocate it towards other safety mechanisms. It is baffling to me that in the era of mental health, in this sort of new era where we're talking more openly about mental health, that if somebody that I know is in crisis, the only option that I have is 911. So how about we divert those funds towards a more tactical mental health citywide service? So instead of 911, you call 711, 811, whatever you want to call it, that would actually bring trained counselors, social workers, people that have more than 6 months tactical training to be providing de-escalation training. If that happened, would we have seen Regis Korchinski Paquette still be alive? Would we still see Andrew Loku still alive? Would we still see Amlisette Halley still alive? Sort of these names of people that have have died, Black and Indigenous people who have died because of a mental wellness check. I think that it's important to looking at gang units and community-based anti-violence programs. We know that the best strategies to be eradicating sort of gang violence and community violence is to be giving the tools to the people who actually live in those communities, to be doing things like trauma counseling, meaningful employment for young people, and community-based anti-violence programs. I think I would like to see a replacement of school police with more counselors, after school programs, smaller class sizes, restorative justice programs. I messed up a lot when I was in school, but that didn't end up with me in handcuffs going to prison. When I was a really young person, adults actually took the time to counsel me on how to be a better human being, whatever that might mean. I would love to see replacement of transit constables with more affordable transit. If someone's jumping the turnstile, it's because they can't afford transit, right? I would love to, I would love to see, like I said, the police wellness with a new mental health sort of first responders unit. I would love to see replacing of police for overdoses with healthcare teams. Right now, when an overdose happens, people call 911 and police are deployed. But actually what's needed is healthcare teams at that moment. There are so many things within routine policing that with a little bit more imagination, we could actually get to the root of the issue and think about solutions that don't involve an armed intervention, solution that doesn't involve criminalizing people that are already criminalized, and solutions that don't involve trapping somebody within a criminal justice system that we know that for many people, once they get in, it's almost impossible to get out.
That's amazing. And it's funny because I remember I went to an event at the Toronto Region Board of Trade, and it was a Police Officer of the Year. It was like the Police Officer of the Year award. And then of the 12 that won it, all 12 were them dealing with a mental wellness check successfully. So it was a really whoa, okay. So completely ill prepared for whatever they were encountering when they showed up. But I'm going to be a bit of a Karen here on this one. But sorry about that. But what about, so the question is going to be what about crime? So one of the questions that people have is, can a defunded police force actually investigate serious crime, criminal investigations and organized crime? That still exists. So
100%.
Will that
100%.
Will that be deeply affected? Do you feel by this radical change, basically in funding?
Yeah, and I actually want to first answer that question with a preamble that Black communities, we too are worried about crime, right? There is in this sort of push to a police-free world, I too want my family safe. I too want my community safe. I too want myself. I want to be safe. Crime still is in existence. So a question that I often have when people ask that is, name me 5 crimes the police are super dope at solving at. Name me a sexual assault victims' rights group that says the police are doing such a great job of solving sexual assaults and rapes in Canada. They don't exist. That's not such a thing, right? So ultimately, I think that we still want to be thinking about how do we actually prioritize safety for everyone? What do we need? What do we need in terms of investigative services? What do we need in terms of law? What do we need in terms of these two things to equip whatever sort of system that we create, whatever sort of service that we create to be tackling hard crimes, whatever you want to call it. I also want to say that a lot of the ways that crime happens is it's like a lot of people are funneled into crime, right? So a lot of people don't grow up wanting to be like, I'm going to be a criminal right now. The circumstances in their lives, from poverty to being criminalized at school, to having no options, to being put in the streets, to being put in gangs, et cetera, often lead people towards a path of criminality. And we allow people to be put in a path of criminality in part because we know that at the end of that path, there's going to be an armed person to take them and to put them in a cage. So we put the solution at the very end of the process, but we're asking for solutions all before it even gets to that stage. But I'm not naive. I know that there's going to need to be investigative services. I know there's going to need to be tactical services that are providing real life safety for people. What we are asking for those is for them to be community specific. What we're asking for those is to be outside of how we imagine this sort of like mega modern policing, and to actually tackle at the root issues. Because what we know right now is that the policing has increased. We're putting 24% of our budgets towards policing, but crimes are still going up. So the police currently are actually ineffective at solving some of these major crimes that we talk about. The solution that we have proposed is not the solution for the issue, which is crime. So I think that there goes back to the conversation around imagination, is if we are really concerned about crime and we actually want to solve some of these real life issues that outside of policing impact us all, it's sort of time to roll up our sleeves and to think about how do we actually solve them in a way that's outside of this current reality.
I love that. It's so fascinating, just this idea of when you said the solution is at the end, like with a prison. Just recalibrate your mind a bit. Put the solution at the beginning of this journey for a young person, and that'll make a huge difference. And
absolutely,
so Ibram Kendi said that the actual foundation of racism isn't ignorance and hate, but self-interest, particularly economic and political and cultural. So in a way, self-interest sets a line. It's really strange, but people will support. They're going to be like out there until it starts to affect them.
Yep.
So how do we tell people to go against their self-interest to fight racism?
That's a very, 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 very good question. I think that part of so there's like a balance of both, the way that I can answer this, because I do definitely agree with that statement in a way. I mean, I'm here having a conversation with you, fighting for all Black lives, in part because of self-interest, because I would love to live a long life.
That's it.
I travel a lot in the States, I travel a lot globally, and I just would love not to get stopped and killed. I have an interest in survival in life, and I have an interest for people that look like me to also be alive. So in a way, I think that the self-interest will still kind of come in the mix. I think that for one way that I can think about it is that it's in all of our best interest to have sort of more safe communities and more safe society. We all win when that happens. If some of these proposals that activists are calling for, these alternatives work, and we have like dedicated sort of systems to deal with mental health, dedicated systems to deal with poverty, dedicated systems to deal with like the school to prison pipeline, dedicated systems to rehabilitate everybody into communities and societies, we all win. It is actually in all of our best interests to ensure that our societies collectively are thriving and are everybody around us are doing well, because we all win by that. So I think that if I instead of sort of leaning away from the sort of the self-interest mindset, I think it's reshaping and reframing what we see as self-interest. So looking at whether or not you're from a racialized community, by that racialized community having access to safety, you win, right? By that community not being criminalized and targeted, you also win, because our communities are winning. one thing that I also think that bears to sort of think about is how racialized Canada is in a process of racialization right now, right? So the Canada of right now is very different than the Canada 50 years ago. As such, we're living in more of these multiracial urban centers, and even rural communities are getting way more multiracial. So these sort of like deep systemic issues, racism, anti-Black racism, white supremacy, colonization, all of these sort of more esoteric terms are actually actively being played out on a regular basis. So we're actually being asked to renegotiate our racial contract as a country over and over and over again. So it is in our self-interest, if we do want to continue to live in this sort of multicultural country, it is actually in our self-interest then to be thinking about these like hard, perhaps radical alternatives, because once the most vulnerable of us are safe and are free, we all will be safe and free.
And that's great. That's a great segue into talking about people of color who are allies to Black people. I'm Filipino, and it's funny because my family, my parents have a very different relationship to the police. For example, they're running away from a dictatorship in the Philippines with a criminal police force.
Yep.
So they love Canada. They love it here. It's amazing, and they feel and how do you, and everything you see on social is black white. It's a very black white discussion on social media. How do we get people of color involved? How can they be? How can they help in terms of just being better allies? Because I it's funny because I always feel like, am I, as an Asian male, it's not like I'm benefiting from a white supremacist society. It's actually it's a problem for me. But I mean, how do we get people of color on side when it comes to the concepts that even like defunding and abolishing? That's actually like, that's a really strange thing for them to hear.
And that's such a wise question to ask, in part because we also I relate to that. I very much relate to that. Like, my parents grew up in Papa Doc, Baby Doc era in Haiti, in which there was literally a police force and then a secret police force. And the secret police force literally mass murdered political dissidents. Like, it was, so the relationship to police is much more global. And as such, coming here and moving in the States, they've had to sort of renegotiate their relationship with police no matter where they're at. So I think that is understandable. It's completely relatable, and it's understandable, particularly communities that have been racialized communities that have fled violence. I think one of the things that I like to sort of think through is that everything's fine until it happens to you, and everything's great until it happens to you. So part of, we might, and however we want to think about it, walk a mile in my shoes, however we want to frame it, I think that every community has a different relationship with the police, and every community and that's valid, and that's totally fine for everyone to sort of negotiate their own relationship with the policing system. I think what we're saying is more or less that even if it doesn't have an impact on yourself, if it has an impact on some of the most marginalized in the community, if it has an impact on even a small section, a small percentage of the community, that's enough for all of us to rally around to support that community. Remembering that Black and Indigenous peoples in this country are a small percentage of the population. And so in Toronto, we are 8% of the population, but we're 20 times more likely to get killed by police. So although we might not have the numbers, we recognize that 8% is not enough legislative power, and that we actually need white folks. We actually need non-Black POCs to actually get with the program and to join us for us to see some of the changes. It sort of is, if we're in positions where our communities are not being criminalized or targeted, if you are in that sort of opportune position, I think it's actually incumbent on you. We need your voices, specifically non-Black people of color. I think that there's also non-Black people of color, although their experience with police might not be the same as ours, we share a common experience around racism. We share a common experience around microaggressions. We share a common experience about that, that colleague that says something and you go, ooh, ooh, I don't know about that. Or you read something in the newspaper and you go, ooh, I don't know about that. Or you watch a character on TV and it's like somebody that looks like you and you're like, ooh, I don't know about that. So the sort of shared experience around the different ways that racism manifest. It's something that brings us together, but that I ask people that to extend their imaginations of thinking beyond TV representation, microaggression, day-to-day racism. There are many people who experience a whole slew of other systemic forms of racism. And as such, sort of like if it happens, I believe personally, if it happens to one of us, it happens to us all. You know, I have access to a home. I have access to jobs. I have access to sort of economic freedom that the people who are in tent cities underneath the Gardner don't have. But watching that tent city get raided, it felt like this. Like, although it didn't individually, I didn't experience that, but I know what it's like to grow up poor. I could connect with my experiences with poverty to then see what could have happened if there weren't interventions in my life. That could have been me. That could have definitely been me. And as such, although I'm not from that community, I feel a sort of need to be amplifying the needs of the street involved in homeless communities that are asking for change, even though it doesn't impact me. So part of that is being allowed to put ourselves in the place of discomfort. And also sometimes there are communities that I'm in allyship with or that I'm supporting that put proposals forward that I'm like, I mean, I personally wouldn't ask for that, but it doesn't matter because I'm not being impacted by the issue. So the person who's being impacted by the issue puts together a proposal of what they think is the best solution forward. And it's up to me then to say, you know what, I'm going to leverage my privilege and give you my vote, my support, my whatever, my amplification for you to be able to implement the solutions that you best believe will solve the issue that impacts you the most.
Yeah, and I love that. This idea of like this like very powerful combination of basically it's empathy and political power. Like if you can put those together, you'll have a lot of success. And that's actually really good into my next question, which is, you know, Hassan Minhaj said in his George Floyd video that legislating and voting changes history and it scales. And how do we use this moment to strengthen political participation? Because you nailed that when you said that, man, Black Lives Matter was killing it, and then they make all these changes in government, and then Doug Ford comes in and they're gone. Like they disappear, and then he's rolling things back as if they never happened. So how do we change that system? It seems like really broken and wrecked, and it's inherently white supremacist in its own way. So how do we change that through political participation for the better? Can we change it from within?
Yeah. Ooh, Jason, you're asking these tough questions today. This is a really, really deep question. I mean, like, you're even within your question, you've really alluded to a big truth around the systems. Like the system really, these systems are not they're not actually broken. They were meant to be this way, right? So these systems of how they were created, like when Indigenous communities are talking about the RCMP, and when I hear people say, well, the RCMP actually, they can be much better. The RCMP was created with the charter in 1873, specifically to rid the community, the land of Indians. So it's at its very core foundation, that particular system was created for one purpose, and it's evolved, but we've seen that purpose manifest in different ways. And so for me, I think that call me perhaps an idealist. I believe in working within both the inside and the outside of the system. I think that we're not really going to see mass participation by vulnerable communities unless we see electoral politics reflect us, and not just having representation, but having enough representation where a diversity of voices are present. So it's not just about having Black folks within electoral politics for me. It's about having a whole wide variety of Black folks that are presenting different opinions, that are themselves perhaps debating what is the best way to move forward, right? I think that we're not really going to see mass change within our sort of political system unless the white supremacist safeguards, the sort of the old world way of doing politics, of engaging with communities, are broken, and doors are open and allowed for people to redefine it themselves. We're not really going to see that if we're expecting people to be fitting within this current rigid structure. I also think that the system continually tells people to wait, and I think that that's precisely why some people feel disillusioned by all these systems, is that we continually tell people to wait for for their own survival. While people are telling you, I can't survive, I can't breathe, I am dying, my people are dying. When you're told to wait, you can see why people take to the streets. You can see why people engage in mass protests. And so for me, I'm really interested in building power in all ways, and recognizing that we build power on the streets, we can build power in the legislative chambers, we can build power even within our workplaces. And so it's sort of I think by having a more engaged population, by giving people space to sort of articulate their politics, to debate their politics, even if that's not done within the legislative framework, what we're doing is we're building more conscious, more political, more critical people. And ultimately, those folks will find their way to funnel within the systems, the legislative systems, all the other systems, and become decision makers. So building power to me is going full circle back to the beginning. The sort of narrative and cultural shift is also building power. And I think it is totally valid, particularly for young people who feel disillusioned by the economic system and the political system, and I think it's totally valid. I see a lot of folks that are my sister's age, my baby sister's age, like 19, 20, 21. The way that they're able to articulate their politics is way further than even me at that age, right? And in part, it's because they're really invested in building power beyond just because they know in part that like themselves, they're not going to get into legislature right now, right? Like they know in part that the way that they're able to build power is to build their communities up. And I think we are not going to see the participation that you ask for unless we see the sort of like mindset shift, cultural shift. It's not just about representation. It's not just about running more Black, Brown, Indigenous people. It's not just about having diverse slates. It really is getting at the core of who we are as Canadians, and what is a sort of Canada that we hope to live in 2050 and 2060 and 2070.
I love that. This idea of like people just, there's a big desire to know more about criminal justice, to know more about education, economics, health, environment, politics. And you're right, that wanting to know more, that wanting to learn that's going to change the world. Absolutely. And this takes me to the lightning round. So the lightning round is I'm going to say 4 words, 2021. I'm going to say a word. So what does that thing look like in the city in 2021? So the first is Toronto Police Services.
Gone, replaced with many other services.
I love it. The Toronto Raptors.
Perhaps another victory. Players and staff given more stake in the business and the corporation as a whole.
That's really interesting. I love that. Trinity Bellwoods.
Diversified.
John Tory.
Gone.
So this is wonderful. We're going to open it up to questions now to the group. So we've compiled some questions. So one of the first questions that I have to ask is from Lisa. What are some good resources that we can use as a starting point to help raise awareness and even check any unconscious biases, prejudices we are not even aware we may have? That's interesting.
Hi, Lisa. Wow, many resources. Behind me are a list of anti-racist books, but it's a little too long to list them out. Well, specifically on the defund police bit, Black Lives Matter Toronto recently launched our website, defundthepolice.org, 2 days ago, which is specifically meant to provide sort of real accessible explanation for some of the major asks around the defund campaign. It also provides a lot of data. It's meant to just be really easily digestible and to sort of give you the arguments when you're talking to your community members or trying to convince your fellow peers of this issue. So that's the defundthepolice.org. I think that in terms of literature, in terms of books, hard soft plug to our book as well, Until We Are Free. Policing Black Lives by Robin Maynard is a great, very, 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 it's a great book. The Racial Contract is also a really great book that really looks at the sort of what are the racial contracts that we are inheriting as people living in 2020 in these more diverse communities. And then for me, it's also, there are thought leaders in this world that everybody should follow. Sandy Hudson, Robin Maynard, Ronaldo Walcott, Patrice Con Colors. I could keep going in terms of like anti-racist thought leaders who put a lot of analysis out on Twitter, on social media. I learn a lot on Twitter and social media. So if you haven't gone on a following spree, usually if you start with one of these folks, you can find who their networks were and just follow them. It's such a great way to get easy analysis and to build your own analysis as well. So those are some of the things that I would recommend, Lisa. But I want to encourage you to sort of make this a lifelong thing. Like I've said, I have firsthand experience of anti-Black racism, and as such, that gives me a level of expertise. But I still have to, in my own work, still actively have to do a lot of reading, because these thoughts are evolving. People are finding words to be able to define things a little bit more. And if you're sort of new to this world of anti-racism, welcome. We're so glad to have you engage in this conversation. I think it's all of us. Let's roll up our sleeves and continue to do the work.
That's amazing. Candice has a question. In her bubble, people talk about sending letters to or emails to local, provincial, and federal politicians. Who should we send letters to? Like, obviously, is mailing John Tory worth it? Like, who do we send letters to really? Like to actually get the attention of people who are in government right now?
Oh, Candice, what a lovely question. I mean, okay, they're not effective. So that's the thing I want to say right off the bat, is that the effectiveness of sending letters, there is, to me, the strong purpose of it is to get politicians or political leaders' attention. So what I know, a number of people who work across all parties as staff or as bureaucrats for different political leaders, and their offices, like their emails do get jammed. Their phones, like they do sort of pay attention when their entire phone lines, entire emails are flooded with thousands of messages. It does push them to change, right? Some of the motions even that we're seeing locally is because some of those councillors' phone lines were jammed completely. So I want to first say that there is use and function in that. Having said that, it is 0.1% of what we should be doing. It is that's what you should be doing. Like before you go to bed, quickly on your phone, let it go. Like it is. What worries me sometimes is that we write a letter and then we're like, well, that's great, we're done now, moving on. And I really want us to recognize and acknowledge that beyond all that the letter does is that it gets the political leaders' attention. It says, oh, my constituents care for this. And especially for the leaders that are not in highly racialized communities, right? Like if you are an MP or an MPP for a community that's not heavily Black or heavily marginalized, you do need to hear from your constituents that this matters to them as well. If you live in a community of privilege, a community of wealth, a community of access, for sure, send the email. But I hope that email is just step one, and that there has to be, same with donating too. Email and donating to a cause, to me, are like step one. Like it has to sort of expand beyond that. If you don't have capacity to do any other things, then I wouldn't spend my whole energy around just the email. It only gets their attention. So I think things like supporting community organizations with your money, your time, your resources, your body, your platform, when there's call outs, responding to them, whether that's come to a sit-in or participate in this thing or come to this event, participating in them, sort of changing the hearts and minds of our own communities. Like right now, a lot of Black folks are doing the educating for everyone, but taking that burden off and do the education for your family, right? Like start with the all your bubble and make it your goal to educate everyone around your bubble. That saves me work, that saves other Black activists work, and that is very effective, right? Like hearing from your own friends about their politics is way more effective than hearing from me. Nonetheless, within the theme of if you're writing a letter because your heart is towards action, recognize that you have to be in it for a little longer than the letter. And that after the letter, ask yourself, what else do I need to do? What else is being asked of me? Look online, look at the organizations, organizations like BLMTO, organizations like Not Another Black Lives, and even organizations like the Black Legal Action Center that don't do activism. They don't do community mobilizing, but they are a resource and an advocate for Black communities. All these different groups often have different call outs and asks for community. And once you see that ask, if you have the capacity, take it up.
Wow, and that just responding to an active community, wow, that'll probably change how you feel entirely about this experience right now, which is really amazing. Another question from Karen is, for the past 5 years, I've been passionately writing and implementing, this is interesting, it's now going into workplaces, implementing diversity training modules within our global company. I find there are endless topics to cover within diversity and inclusion to create a culture of change. But what would you consider the 3 topics to focus on in terms of educating and promoting more influence?
Very good question. This was Karen, right? You said?
Yes.
Karen. Very good question, Karen. I think even before implementing diversity training, I think that it is significantly easier to understand and to take in diversity training when you have a diverse workplace. So what I mean by that is that it becomes less sort of theoretical. Place is diverse and actively having to have conversations on how to be more inclusive or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So before even doing the training, I'd say thinking of the praxis, thinking of how to create how to create space for there to have already been diverse racialized voices within your workplace, which will make it significantly easier when you're coming in and doing diversity training for your non-racialized or your non-queer or your non-marginalized workers to then be able to contextualize what this theoretical issue is because they're in a workplace that's actively talking about it. For me, I think one can't understand racism without understanding white supremacy, and one can't talk about racism without being uncomfortable enough to name and to identify white supremacy and whiteness, and how white supremacy is a sort of framework that we every one of us, white and non-white alike, are asked to engage with in some way. I think that in terms of diversity training, we have to have a conversation around Indigenous reconciliation, around Indigenous resurgence in this country from a critical lens, and sort of the relations with Indigenous and settler relations in this country. I think that has to sort of be a foundation for any sort of conversation, because it is literally the foundation from which Canada was built on. And I think the third bit is a sort of more comprehensive look at a lineage of Blackness and anti-Blackness within Canada. I can't tell you how many people I have to explain that actually there are the 200 years of slavery in Canada. And most people in our history books, we were told about the United States, we were told about Martin Luther King, we were told about the things in the US, but very few of us actually know about the lineage and the history of systemic racism, of anti-Blackness, of anti-Black racism within Canada, within our jurisdictions alone. So I'm a history freak. I think that it's hard to understand contemporary issues without understanding their lineage. It's hard to understand why these sort of issues flare up without understanding the ways that they've been simmering for a long time. And I do think that even in a workplace, and I've been in workplaces that have engaged in this conversation, even in a workplace, I think you'd be surprised by how much space there'd be for people to have this sort of conversation, or how much interest that there might be for people to have these conversations. Yeah, I think that hopefully that answered your question, Karen. I think that I encourage everyone here who's watching this that all of your existing models and existing practices or programs or whatever diversity programs, models, whatever you have done in the past, I think that I encourage you to go look at them with folks from the community that are either working for your organization or someone that you bring in externally, hopefully someone that's working with your organization, but looking at the sort of diversity programs, practices that you're doing. And I think it's time to supersize them and thinking of how to take them to the next level. So if it is that every year you do a 1-day anti-racism training, do you have resources to make that 3 days spread throughout the week, the year, plus resources that are sent out? How can we take the sort of practices that we're doing and amplifying them extremely? Because it's sort of, the house has been burning for a while, and I oftentimes fear that we're just throwing small buckets of water at it. And so it sort of requires, even us as BLMTO, we've had to supersize our activism because our audience is so much larger now. So there's a sense of the urgency to get some of these changes is so much more present. And so whatever practices, whatever initiatives, whatever programs, whatever fund, whatever your workplace is doing right now, I encourage you to look critically on how to either insert a little bit more critical perspective to it, and or how to supersize it.
Wow, that was amazing. Well, that takes us to the end of our time. This was an incredible hour, Rodney. I really enjoyed talking to you today, and thank you so much to everyone who joined us. We'll have a recap of this experience on the website very shortly, but please spread the word. Please support Black Lives Matter Toronto. But thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to keeping this conversation going and continuing the work.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being here. Thank you for everyone for being here.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.